By the time the monitor began its thin, frantic scream, Alina Vale already had a cardboard box in her hands. It was 2:19 in the morning at St. Catherine's Medical Center in San Diego, and the fluorescent lights in the emergency corridor washed everything in the same exhausted shade. The walls looked pale, the floor looked wet even when it was dry, and every face seemed harder than it really was. Alina stood just outside Trauma Bay 3 with a termination envelope tucked under the edge of the box, her stethoscope coiled on top of a folded navy sweater, while nurse manager Dana Kessler delivered the kind of carefully flattened words institutions use when they want cruelty to sound procedural. Dana informed her that the termination was effective immediately and that security would escort her once she cleared her locker. Inside the trauma bay, someone shouted for suction. Alina turned toward the sound before she answered. Her expression barely shifted, but her eyes sharpened. The patient in Bay 3, she said, was losing his airway. Dr. Marcus Bell, the trauma attending, stood just inside the room with his sterile gown half-tied and irritation already arranged across his face. He did not step out and did not lower his voice. He told her she was finished there and would not be allowed to play savior on her way out. A younger resident near the foot of the bed gave a short, nervous laugh, while another glanced at Alina and immediately looked away. Everyone heard the tone. Everyone understood the hierarchy. The quiet nurse had finally crossed the wrong man. Then the patient's rhythm changed again, and Alina stopped looking at Bell. She looked at the monitor, at the angle of the man's neck, at the gray cast beneath his skin, at the transport note folded on the tray, and at the wet sand still trapped in the tread of a paramedic's boot. In a second, she saw what the room had missed. She said the patient's pressure was dropping because they were treating the wrong problem. Bell answered with a humorless smile and called for security. 2 guards started down the hall. Alina shifted the box to one arm and took a single step toward the doorway anyway. It was not a dramatic step or a loud one, only the smallest possible act of refusal, but that somehow made it worse for everyone watching. Bell told her to move. She did not. A second alarm joined the first. Somewhere downstairs, ambulance doors slammed open. Somewhere near the ambulance bay, a radio announced an inbound from Coronado. Somewhere else, the hospital kept moving, because hospitals always move, even when a life is being ruined in full view. By sunrise, a man with a commander's bearing would whisper a single call sign in that corridor, and everyone who had smirked at Alina Vale would wish they had listened while she was still only asking them to save a patient. Alina had worked at St. Catherine S. for 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4 nights. People who did not notice details called her forgettable. People who did notice details found her unsettling in ways they could never quite explain. She was 34, slight, dark-haired, and self-contained, with a stillness that registered as shyness until something urgent happened. Then it became obvious that it was not shyness at all. It was control. She moved like someone who conserved energy on purpose, spoke softly enough that people had to lean in, and never raised her voice across a room. She did not join in the loose, cynical gossip that threaded through the night shift, and she never lingered at the nurses' station to compete for attention. That alone was enough to make her suspect. St. Catherine's liked charisma. It liked people who could perform urgency before they had solved anything. It liked confidence presented as noise. Marcus Bell fit the culture so perfectly that some people stopped noticing he was the culture. He was 42, polished, famous enough in hospital circles to be invited to galas, handsome in the carefully maintained way of men who expected cameras, and gifted at the kind of public reassurance donors adored. He liked control, liked being watched, and liked the little pause people made before disagreeing with him. He was not incompetent, which was what made him dangerous. He was competent enough to get away with pride, and Bell hated being corrected. The first time Alina embarrassed him, she did it by accident. A post-operative patient in observation had started to crash quietly, not with theatrical collapse, but with the kind of subtle decline that hides in a room full of conversation. Alina noticed the altered breathing, the wrong shade of the lips, and the pulse pattern that did not fit the chart. She called Bell twice. He dismissed it over the phone. Alina initiated a rapid response anyway. The patient survived. Bell walked out of the review with a note in his file and never forgave her. After that, she became the quiet nurse, a label that began as a joke and settled into habit. Rissy. Dent said it in the break room with the kind of laugh people use when they want contempt to sound harmless. In charting huddles, someone would ask whether the quiet nurse had spotted another invisible disaster. In the trauma bay, Bell once told a new intern that if Vale ever looked worried, the intern should listen because she was like a smoke alarm with legs, though he added that no one should let her think she ran the room. Alina heard more than they knew. She simply refused to spend energy defending herself against people who measured worth by volume. There were breadcrumbs for anyone patient enough to notice. Alina carried a pale line across the base of one thumb, too straight to be a kitchen burn or an ordinary childhood accident. She taped her fingers faster than most athletes. She never sat with her back to a door. She knew how to calm panicked veterans without asking them what had triggered them. She could look at a tray of equipment and tell immediately what had been used out of order. During her first week, she found an expired emergency airway kit 3 hours before inspection, and quietly replaced it without telling anyone she had saved the department from a citation. Miguel, one of the respiratory therapists, noticed more than most. He once asked her during a 4 a.m. restock whether she had been military. Alina kept folding gauze and answered in a way that was not an answer at all, saying only that a lot of people had been military. Miguel grinned and observed that the refusal itself was an answer. Alina almost smiled but did not quite allow herself the full expression. Another clue appeared in the way she ate. Alina took meals fast, clean, and without looking down much. The first time she sat in the staff room with a paperback novel, one of the residents joked that she looked as though she belonged in a library rather than an emergency department. Alina replied that libraries were full of people who knew exactly where things were. The room laughed, but not because they thought she was clever. They laughed because Belle laughed. At St. Catherine's, laughter flowed downhill. Belle's closest ally in management was Dana Kessler, the nurse manager, a woman who believed fiercely in optics and almost as fiercely in Belle. Dana had built her survival strategy around proximity to power. She spoke about policy the way some people speak about scripture, but only when policy protected the people she liked. When it did not, she called it a gray area. Alina had been a gray area since orientation. Dana once told HR in a conversation Alina was never meant to hear that Alina was technically excellent but had a communication problem. The problem was simple. Alina did not flatter superiors, did not scramble to make herself socially legible, and did not dilute serious concerns to protect feelings. She documented cleanly, escalated when necessary, and signed her name under facts. That made people nervous. Worst part in Belle's view was that patients trusted her. Not in a cinematic, miraculous way, but in the small, real ways that matter inside hospitals. Frightened, embarrassed, disoriented, grieving, or proud patients seemed to settle when Alina took over. She remembered family names. She noticed wedding rings turned inward. She adjusted blankets without turning kindness into performance. She could talk to elderly patients without patronizing them and to combative patients without sounding threatened. Twice security had been able to back away because she de-escalated situations no one else could reach. Belle did not like that. The hidden rule at St. Catherine's was that everyone could have one defining trait, and Belle preferred Alina's trait to remain quiet. The moment it began to look more like better under pressure than the rest of us, the room became uncomfortable for him. 3 days before she was fired, Alina submitted an incident report about a trauma cart that had been signed off as complete while missing critical items, including a backup laryngoscope battery and a sealed medication vial with a broken chain of custody. Nothing had gone wrong yet. That was exactly why she filed it. Prevention is invisible when it works. Dana called her into the office the next morning and suggested she could have brought it informally. Alina answered that she was bringing it formally. Dana said Alina knew how it would read. Alina said that it would read accurately. Dana tried again, calling it accusatory. Alina answered that it was a safety report. Dana said intent mattered. Alina answered that documentation mattered too. The smile left Dana's face. Belle had been copied on the report because the cart belonged to trauma. By that evening, the temperature around Alina dropped. Residents who had once made ordinary small talk stopped. An intern who used to ask her for advice avoided standing beside her. Belle made rounds with exaggerated cheer, which was always the sign that he intended to punish someone later. Then came tea. He donor dinner. St. Catherine's was raising money for a new surgical wing, and Belle was scheduled to speak. The hospital needed him charming, visible, and untroubled by internal friction. Alina, inconveniently, filed a second note that afternoon after finding a transfer summary altered to make a delayed consult look timely. She attached timestamps. That was the beginning of the end. Belle intercepted her near the medication room just before shift change. The corridor lights were dimmed to evening mode and his reflection doubled in the glass. He told her she had made her point. Alina said she had documented a discrepancy. Belle corrected her, saying she had documented a narrative. Alina replied that she had documented times. He stepped closer, not enough for anyone else to call it threatening, only enough to force proximity. Then he spoke plainly. She was a nurse on a probationary extension, he reminded her, and this was not how she built a career. Alina answered that a chart was not a technicality. For a second, something cold crossed Bell's face. Then footsteps approached, and his public expression slid back into place. He told her to get some rest because she looked stressed. He said it warmly and loud enough for others to hear. That night, an older janitor found Alina washing out a coffee mug long after everyone else had gone. He asked whether she was all right. She gave the answer tired people give when they are not all right and do not intend to explain, saying it had been a long day. The janitor told her she always seemed to know when a bad one was coming. Alina dried the mug and said that sometimes the room got quiet in the wrong way. The next night, a transfer came in from a private clinic with chest pain and altered speech. Bell dismissed it as anxiety complicated by medication. Alina asked one extra question, watched the patient's face, and caught the stroke symptoms before the scan order had even been placed. Bell hated her most when she was right in front of witnesses. Priya Shah, the resident on that case, noticed. Priya was smart enough to understand what was happening and junior enough to be frightened by it. She had entered medicine believing facts would win. Her first year had been a long education in ego. Once, alone at the charting station, she asked Alina why she stayed. Alina answered that patients did not get to choose which room they landed in. Priya said that sounded like something Alina told herself. Alina admitted that it was. When Priya asked whether there was anything Bell did not know about her, Alina said yes and left it there. At 1:47 in the morning, the dispatch call came in. There had been a multi-vehicle collision on the bridge off Coronado, with civilian injuries, possible military personnel involved, saltwater exposure, one critical patient inbound by air, two by ground, and more statuses unknown. The emergency department changed shape at once. Chairs scraped back, wheels unlocked, and casual posture vanished. Alina was in Trauma Bay 3 before Bell reached the board. She checked suction, oxygen, line access, warm blankets, and backup monitor leads. She opened drawers and saw that the exact missing item she had reported 3 days earlier had been replaced with the wrong size backup. Someone had checked the box without understanding the contents. Her jaw tightened once. That was all. Miguel entered with respiratory support and asked whether anyone knew more. Alina answered that there had been saltwater, bridge impact, and an unknown mechanism. Miguel muttered that mystery trauma was his favorite kind with the weary sarcasm of night staff who had seen too much. Priya came in tying back her hair. Bell followed with the brisk confidence of a man certain the room would obey him. He assigned Alina to medications and lines and took control of the bay. It could have been a normal trauma intake. Then Dana appeared in the doorway holding a slim folder. Something in her tone made Miguel look up. Alina asked whether Dana meant now. Dana's professional smile had that brittle, pre-rehearsed quality that meant the decision had been made elsewhere and rehearsed in legal language. Before Alina could step out, the paramedics burst through the ambulance entrance. There was blood on uniforms, salt water dripping from fabric, and the sharp mingled smell of fuel and antiseptic. The first patient was a young woman who was conscious and crying. The second was semi-conscious with an unstable leg injury. Then the air team rolled in the critical patient, and the room narrowed around him. He was male, late 30s, heavily built, in severe respiratory distress, unidentified, his dog tags removed for imaging. He wore civilian clothes beneath a tactical jacket. Sand clung to him. Salt dried on the seams. He had bruising, a dislocated shoulder, low oxygen despite support, and a blood pressure already sliding. Bell took the head of the bed and called it likely blunt trauma with aspiration. He ordered preparation for intubation. Alina heard the transport medic say that the man had crashed twice in transit and had kept trying to say a name. She asked what name. The medic said he had not caught it clearly, only that it sounded something like Sparrow. Bell cut in and told everyone to focus. The patient's hand lifted weakly from the gurney, fingers flexing as if reaching for something not there. Alina touched his wrist and told him he was at St. Catherine's and needed to stay with them. His eyelids twitched and his lips moved, but no sound came out. Then Dana repeated that HR had authorized immediate termination and that Alina needed to step out. Nobody answered. For one suspended second, the room held 2 emergencies. Bell made the choice for everyone by ordering Alina to do what Dana said. He did not even turn around when he said it. Alina stared at him, then at the patient, then at the monitor. The rhythm was wrong, not catastrophic yet, but wrong in a way that did not match Bell's plan. She said the man's neck was shifting and told them to listen to the right side. Bell told her not now. Alina insisted that the right side was too quiet. Bell snapped her name. Priya's eyes flicked to the chest, then the monitor. Miguel listened too late and heard it. One side, one breath, too little air. Dana stepped forward and held out the folder as if they were in an office and not standing inside the smell of salt water, blood, and alarms. She asked for Alina's badge. Alina unclipped it and set it on the counter without taking her eyes off the patient. Then the oxygen saturation dropped harder and the room changed. Later, people would remember Alina's movement differently. Some said she moved too fast to track. Others said she hardly moved at all and simply seemed to be where she needed to be. One resident would insist for years that Alina still had the cardboard box in one arm when she corrected the room, though that was not true. She had set the box down carefully outside the bay, the way someone might put away something fragile before stepping into fire. She said the patient's trachea was shifting, that this was not just aspiration, and that he was building pressure. Bell snapped that she was no longer part of the team. Alina did not answer him. She looked at Priya and told her to listen. Priya put her stethoscope down and listened once. Her face tightened at once. The right side was nearly absent. Miguel was already moving, and the monitor dipped again. The patient pulled one desperate breath and could not finish it. Bell did what proud men do when reality outruns them. He hesitated. It was not a long hesitation, only long enough to become dangerous. Alina did not wait for permission. She called for a decompression set immediately, and her tone changed the room more than her words. It was not louder, not panicked, only absolute. It carried the authority of someone who had stood in worse rooms and come out of them alive. Miguel threw her the kit. Priya moved before she was told again. The transport medic backed clear, eyes wide. Bell started to object, but the patient's pressure collapsed on the screen and the objection died there. Alina stabilized the man with clean, practiced precision. There was no flourish and no speech, only exact hands, exact timing, and complete awareness of the body under stress. Trapped pressure released. The airway improved. The chest began to move more evenly. Within seconds, the monitor started climbing back from the edge. Nobody in the room breathed normally until the patient did. Bell stared at the screen as if it had betrayed him. Priya looked at Alina like she had discovered a hidden doorway in a familiar wall. Miguel muttered under his breath, asking who Alina really was. Alina did not answer. She was already adjusting lines, checking pupils, correcting a medication dose a resident nearly pushed too fast, and calling for warmed fluids before Bell's order had fully formed. For the next 4 minutes, the room obeyed her without discussing why. Outside, the second and third victims were being triaged. Rain had begun somewhere over the city, and the ambulance bay doors kept opening on gusts of cold air that smelled of ocean and diesel. Overhead pages blurred together. A technician nearly collided with security. Dana stood frozen at the threshold, termination folder still in her hand, no longer sure what scene she was in. The unidentified patient grabbed weakly at Alina's sleeve once more as consciousness surfaced and sank again. Alina leaned close and told him to take it easy. His cracked lips formed the same word again. This time Priya heard it too, Sparrow. Alina's face did not change, but something behind her eyes went still in a deeper way. Bell noticed and asked whether she knew him. Alina said no too quickly. Bell stored that away. Once the patient was stable enough, he went to imaging. Alina gave a handoff so precise that the radiology nurse later wrote half of it down verbatim. Bell tried to reclaim command by turning the moment into a sequence of orders, but the damage to hierarchy had already happened. The room had seen who found the problem. The room had seen who hesitated. Rooms like that remember. The second crisis struck before anyone had time to absorb the first. A failure alarm sounded in Bay 2 while bridge victims were still coming in. It was the worst kind of equipment problem, not total collapse, but a partial malfunction that creates confusion because everything almost works. The backup battery for a critical airway device failed its self-check. It was exactly the issue Alina had reported. Bell swore under his breath. Dana stared at the cart as if it had personally betrayed her. Miguel said, not quite softly enough, that he thought there had been an incident report about that. Nobody answered him. Alina did not waste time saying she had warned them. She rerouted the setup, grabbed alternative equipment, reassigned a tech, and kept the flow from stalling. To people at the doorway, it looked effortless. To anyone who understood the stakes, it looked like the prevention of a disaster the rest of them had not been ready to stop. Bell should have thanked her then. Instead, he told her to stay in her lane. Alina looked at him once and answered that she was. The child in Bay 2 stabilized. The child's mother wept into the sleeve of a nurse who had mocked Alina 3 nights earlier. By 3:15, both active bays were controlled. The incoming surge slowed. The unidentified man from Coronado remained critical but alive. Bridge victims had been distributed. Radiology called with findings that confirmed complex chest trauma and significant inhalation injury, but not the internal catastrophe Bell had originally assumed. Alina's correction had mattered in the most concrete way possible. Bell knew it. Fear entered the room then, not Alina's fear, but Bell's. Competence can be dismissed when it is annoying. Competence with witnesses becomes a threat. There was more proof. The patient from Coronado came back from imaging agitated, fighting the mask, not fully conscious, his blood pressure fluctuating dangerously. Bell ordered restraints. Alina recognized the pattern first and told him to wait. She said the man was not combative, he was orienting off sound. Bell demanded to know what that even meant. Alina leaned close to the man's ear and told him in a voice almost too low to hear that he was secure in a hospital and should follow her voice. His breathing eased, not magically, not fully, but enough to prove she was right. Without opening his eyes, he raised 2 fingers weakly in a signal none of the civilians in the room understood. Alina answered with the smallest nod. Miguel saw it, Priya saw it, Bell did not. The man settled, nobody laughed at the quiet nurse anymore. At 3:31 the chart was updated. It listed the airway correction, stabilization under emergency conditions, equipment contingency management, and improved patient response to verbal orientation. Bell's name remained on the attending line. Alina's contribution was visible in the timestamps and nursing notes. Bell read them all and went very still. He understood that Alina had saved him from an error that would survive discovery, and he also understood that if the full picture remained intact, people might start asking why the nurse they mocked performed like someone trained in far harsher environments than civilian emergency medicine. Bell did not like questions that dug. He stepped into the corridor where Dana was waiting. He told her to finish it. She asked whether he meant now after Alina had just saved a patient. Bell said especially now. Dana said Alina had acted outside the chain of command. Bell said he wanted her gone before the board heard about the cart, the transfer note, or anything else he suspected she was collecting. Dana asked whether he really thought Alina was collecting. Bell answered with a brief, ugly smile that people like her always were. St. Catherine's was not rotten all the way through, which made it harder to see and harder to fix. Fully rotten places are easier. Better stories happen in institutions with enough good people to make corruption look temporary. At 3:45, with adrenaline still hanging in the air and antiseptic still sharp in every surface, Dana called Alina into the glass-walled consult room beside the nurse's station. Bell came too. So did security. Priya saw them and started to stand. Miguel put a hand on her sleeve, not to stop her forever, only to keep her from exploding at the wrong moment. They both knew it was going to be ugly. The consult room held 1 table, 4 chairs, and framed mission statements that suddenly looked obscene. Compassion, integrity, excellence. Dana set the termination packet on the table like it had moral authority and informed Alina that her employment was terminated effective immediately for insubordination, repeated disruption of physician. Led care and failure to adhere to chain of command. Alina remained standing. Bell folded his arms and said she had directly intervened in attending-level decisions after being ordered not to. Alina answered that she intervened because the patient was decompensating. Bell called that only her opinion. Priya flinched visibly outside the glass. Alina turned to Dana and said they were terminating her for correcting a life-threatening omission and for filing safety reports. Dana said it was not a debate. Alina replied that it was documentation. Bell laughed and called it a martyr act. Alina did not react to the laugh, which seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. Dana pushed the acknowledgement page toward her and ordered her to sign. Alina read every line. She did not skim. She read the accusation that she had interfered with patient care after removal from duty, and then she noted aloud what the document omitted, that the airway device in Bay 2 had failed exactly as she reported it would, that the trauma cart had been incorrectly certified, and that Bell had missed tension physiology in Bay 3. Bell told her to be careful. Alina answered that she was being accurate. Dana demanded a signature or refusal. Alina took the pen. For a second, Bell looked relieved. Then Alina wrote the phrase received under protest beside the signature line and added the exact date, time, and initials. Bell stared at the page as if he had been slapped. He asked whether she thought that mattered. Alina said it always mattered. Then the room changed again. Security had expected tears. Dana had expected pleading. Bell had expected anger because anger would let him recast her as unstable. Alina gave them none of it. She picked up the cardboard box, tucked the envelope under one arm, and requested preservation of all badge access logs, trauma bay camera footage, medication dispensing records, and cart inspection signatures from the last 72 hours. Belle actually blinked. Dana recovered first and reminded Alina that she was no longer in a position to request anything. Alina said she was aware. Dana told her to stop pretending she ran risk management. Alina answered that she was asking as a former employee who believed evidence should remain intact. Belle leaned in with a smile that never reached his eyes and told her that former employee was exactly right. Outside the room, heads had turned. Staff never looked directly at a public humiliation like that. They looked sideways at reflections through computer screens through the black mirror of a powered-off monitor. Hospitals are full of witnesses pretending not to be witnesses. Alina stepped into the corridor carrying the box. No one moved. Belle made sure his voice carried when he said that skill did not excuse insubordination. It was the perfect line if intimidation had been his goal. It was also the line half the department would remember later, when investigators asked whether his conduct had been measured. Priya took a step toward Alina, but Alina gave the smallest shake of her head. Not now. Priya stood there with both hands clenched and did nothing, which would haunt her until dawn. Miguel was harder to control. He said aloud that Alina had saved that patient. Belle turned on him and invited him to keep talking if he wanted to join her. Miguel looked like he might. Alina stopped him from 10 feet away without even turning around. She said only his name. That was enough. Belle noticed that too. Then he noticed something else. Priya still had the preliminary transport note open on a tablet, and at the bottom, beneath intake code and incomplete identifiers, a line of contact instructions had finally populated from the receiving system. It directed staff to notify a naval special warfare liaison upon stabilization. Belle felt his stomach drop. The patient from Coronado was not random. Dana began clearing the hallway. Alina walked toward the staff lockers under escort, box against her ribs, while the overhead lights hummed and the corridor pretended that none of this was happening. On the way she passed Bay 3. The patient lay sedated now, oxygenation improved, vitals still guarded but steadier. Sea salt remained in the folds of his hair. For a fraction of a second, his eyelids fluttered. Alina did not stop walking. Inside the room, his hand lifted weakly from the blanket, two fingers curling toward the air as if he were trying to hold onto a signal he had heard before. At her locker, Alina packed with the ruthless efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that public exits should be brief. Sweater, phone charger, spare hair tie, novel, compression socks, protein bar, a small tin of peppermints. At the very back under folded scrubs, Priya noticed something that did not belong in an ordinary nurse's locker. It was a worn metal challenge coin. One side bore no hospital insignia, only an eagle, an anchor, and a trident dulled by years of handling. Priya inhaled sharply. Alina saw where she was looking and closed the locker before Belle or security could get the angle. Neither woman said a word. At 4:12, Alina signed the property release and surrendered her staff parking tag. At 4:14, Belle entered an addendum into the chart. He wrote that nurse Alina Vale, already under administrative removal, had created confusion in the trauma bay by inserting herself into physician-led treatment. He omitted the order timing that made his claim questionable and framed her intervention as disruptive but ultimately non-material to the outcome. On many nights, that sort of note might have worked. This was not one of those nights. At 4:26, the naval liaison arrived. He did not come in uniform or with spectacle. He wore civilian clothes and carried a posture that made people step aside before they knew why. He introduced himself at the front desk as Commander Nathan Cross. The clerk called upstairs to Belle. Belle straightened his coat before taking the elevator, thinking he still had time to manage the narrative. Nathan Cross did not look like a man who needed to repeat himself. He was perhaps in his early 40s, though weathering around the eyes made age seem beside the point. He wore dark slacks, a charcoal jacket, and a watch that was either expensive or indestructible. His voice was low. His questions were exact. Belle met him outside imaging with the polished assurance of a physician who believed he could still define the story. He gave a smooth summary of collision, water exposure, respiratory compromise, stabilization, and appropriate intervention. He made it sound collaborative and controlled. Cross listened without interrupting, then asked who had recognized the pressure problem before intubation. Belle paused a fraction too briefly. He said his team had responded quickly. Cross said that was not the question. Belle smiled and spoke of collective emergency care. Cross looked past him through the glass and said someone had heard it first. Bell tried to redirect, mentioning that a nurse had created some confusion but that the patient was stable. Cross asked for the nurse's name. Bell said it was not relevant. Cross asked again. Bell finally gave it. Alina Vale. Cross did not visibly react, but one finger tapped once against his jacket seam. He asked where she was. Bell said she had been removed from duty for unrelated conduct issues. Cross repeated the word removed, then confirmed that it had happened that night, during the case, after, or during treatment. Bell insisted there had been pre-existing problems. Cross studied him in a stillness so complete that Bell suddenly sounded over-explained even to himself. Then Cross asked to see the chart. Bell tried to hide behind privacy protocols. Cross answered that he was not asking for a souvenir. Bell said it was a hospital workflow issue. Cross asked how many minutes had elapsed between observable asymmetry and corrective intervention. Bell did not answer. Priya did. She said it had been less than 1 minute after Nurse Vale called it. Bell turned on her so sharply that the clerk behind the desk flinched. Cross lifted one hand without looking up, and Bell stopped speaking. At the nurse's station, the room changed shape again. Staff stood straighter. Voices dropped. Priya felt her pulse jump, though she could not yet have said why. Miguel glanced toward the employee exit where Alina had vanished and knew the night was not over. Cross read the chart faster than Bell expected. He read the physician note, the nursing notes, the transport note, the imaging preliminaries, the medication administration record, and then requested the audit trail from the informatics tech nearby. Bell said this was becoming disproportionate. Cross kept reading. He asked who had signed off Bay 2 airway backup readiness that week. Dana had just arrived and tried to call it internal. Cross asked for the name. She swallowed and explained that it had been delegated through shift lead review. Miguel said quietly that this meant nobody had actually checked it. Bell cut him a look sharp enough to slice paper. Cross then asked for the camera footage from Bay 3 and the consult room. Bell protested that this required approval. Cross clarified that he was asking for preservation, not deletion. No one had said anything about deletion. The fact that Cross did hit the room like cold air. Dana lost color. Priya stared. Bell laughed once and insisted no one was deleting anything. Cross said that if so, preserving it should not trouble him. He then instructed the ward clerk to note formally, for risk and legal, that he was requesting preservation of all electronic records, device logs, access logs, and audiovisual data related to the patient admitted from Coronado at 0226. The clerk asked whether she should send that to legal. Cross said it should go to legal, compliance, and anyone in the hospital who still remembered the meaning of liability. Bell opened his mouth. ND closed it again. Cross then asked Priya whether Alina had left voluntarily. Priya glanced at Bell and answered that Alina had been terminated. Cross asked by whom. Priya looked at Dana. Dana stiffly answered that it had been done by administrative authority. Cross asked one final quiet question. He wanted to know whether Alina had saved the patient. No one answered for a moment. Miguel did. He said yes. Cross nodded as if a piece had fallen into place. Administration arrived quickly once liability entered the bloodstream. An overnight nursing supervisor appeared, then the on-call administrator, then a compliance officer still buttoning her coat. Phones came out. Voices lowered. The framed mission statement near the station suddenly looked like possible evidence. Cross did not grandstand. That made him more intimidating. He asked for the patient's personal effects bag. Inside were a water-damaged wallet, a broken watch, a military ID card sealed by security, and a folded scrap of waterproof paper with numbers written in block print. On the back was a single handwritten word, Sparrow. Cross's thumb went still on it. Bell saw that, and so did Priya. Cross folded the paper, slid it back into the property bag, and said he wanted Alina Vale contacted immediately. Dana tried to answer that it might not be possible because Alina was no longer employed. Cross replied that her employment status affected payroll, not the hospital's phone system. The compliance officer, reading incident notices with growing horror, said they would reach out. Bell called the reaction disproportionate. Cross turned toward him and said that the man in the bay served under him had survived because someone Bell fired recognized what Bell missed, and that if Bell wanted proportion, he should pray the footage agreed with him. Alina was in the parking structure when Priya found her. Not at the ground-level exit, but higher up on level 4 where the concrete held the night cold, and the city lights beyond the ramp looked distant and unreal. Alina stood beside an aging dark blue sedan with a cardboard box on the hood. She had changed out of her hospital shoes into running shoes, as if preparing to walk farther than necessary. Priya arrived out of breath and said that they were looking for her. Alina asked who they meant. Priya answered that a Navy commander named Nathan Cross had come for her. For the first time all night, Alina's stillness shifted. She repeated his name once as if confirming it against memory. Priya said the patient had known her too and had said Sparrow. Alina asked whether he had really been conscious enough for that. Priya said barely. Alina lowered her eyes, not in fear but in calculation and memory. Priya pushed and asked what Sparrow was. Alina told her it was a name from before. Priya asked before what. Alina answered that it belonged to a part of her life that did not remain in files people could access from a nursing station. Priya should have stopped there, but the night had stripped too much away. She said that Alina had saved Belle and Belle had fired her anyway. Alina answered that she had saved the patient. Priya said that was not all she had done. Alina admitted it was not, but said it was the part that mattered. Then Alina's phone vibrated. Unknown number. She stared at it long enough for the second buzz to begin, then answered. Priya could only hear Alina's side, but the change in posture said enough. Alina confirmed her name, then listened. She answered yes, then no, then closed her eyes briefly when the voice on the other end said something that settled heavily. She asked how bad the patient was. After another pause, she said she was nearby and could return. Then she listened once more and answered that she understood and that she knew this one. When the call ended, Priya asked. Alina said the patient was alive and improving. Priya said that was good. Alina agreed, but her eyes had gone distant. She said Nathan Cross did not call unless the night was about to become public. Only then, out in the cold, open parking structure where there was no room at all, did Alina answer the question of who she was. She told Priya that 10 years earlier she had been a hospital corpsman attached to a unit she was still not going to name. Later, she had bridged into advanced trauma training and then nursing. Somewhere in the middle, she had acquired a call sign she never asked for and had hoped never to hear again in a civilian hallway. Priya stared. Alina said she had left that life on purpose. When Priya asked why, Alina said that some kinds of service teach you how quickly institutions spend people who stay useful too long. Priya thought of the challenge coin, the two-finger signal, the patient orienting to Alina's voice, and the word Sparrow. She asked whether the patient was someone important. Alina answered only that they all were. Another call came through, this time from the hospital administrator. Alina declined it. Priya raised an eyebrow. Alina said that if they wanted her back, they could come ask in person. They did. By 4:58, the on-call administrator, the compliance officer, and Commander Nathan Cross stepped onto level 4 with a security guard trailing awkwardly behind them, no longer sure whether he was escorting a fired employee or accompanying a legal emergency. The cold air met them all at once. Alina stood straight as they approached. The administrator thanked her for waiting. Alina answered that she had not been waiting for him. A silence followed. Cross almost smiled. The administrator tried again and said they would appreciate the chance to discuss the night's events. Alina looked only at Cross and asked how the patient was. Cross said he was stable enough to stay angry. That answer meant more between them than Priya could decode. Alina nodded once. The compliance officer stepped forward and said there were concerns about Alina's termination and that the hospital wanted to clarify the circumstances. Alina asked whether they intended to clarify them or reverse them. Silence followed again. Cross spared them by saying that they wanted both. Alina shifted the box from the hood of the car into her arms and told them to say the true thing first. To his credit, the administrator did. He said the termination was under immediate review pending preservation of records and formal investigation. Alina said that was not good enough. The compliance officer asked what would be. Alina answered without heat. She wanted written rescission, a preservation order copied to outside counsel if necessary, removal of false language from her file, protection for staff witnesses, an immediate audit of trauma readiness documentation, and no retaliation against Priya Shah or respiratory. The administrator said that was substantial. Alina said it was the minimum. Cross told him to write it down. He did. The compliance officer then asked, for the record, whether Alina had known the patient before that night. Alina asked whether the question was about clinical conflict or whether they were fishing for a way to protect a physician who had filed a false note. The officer said it was about clinical conflict. Alina answered no. She had not identified him before intervention, though she recognized indicators later. Cross added that this aligned with her notes and the transport record. The administrator nodded too fast. The power Belle carried inside smaller rooms was already leaking away under concrete dawn light, and the presence of a witness no longer isolated. Before Priya left, Alina told her to go back inside and watch what changed. Dawn spread gray-blue over San Diego. Hospitals at dawn are bad places for liars. Night staff are too tired to keep protecting stories, while day staff arrive rested enough to ask questions. Administrators appear in full daylight with coffee and liability in their hands. By 5:30, the preservation order had gone out. By 5:40, Bell knew. He was in the physician dictation room, polishing his account for the third time when his badge failed to open one of the internal cabinets reserved for attendings. To anyone else, it would have been nothing. To Bell, it felt like the first crack in a wall. He went straight to Dana's office. Dana was already fielding calls, and her face had lost the last of its earlier authority. Compliance wanted her inspection signatures. Risk wanted the safety reports. Legal wanted her full timeline. The administrator wanted to know why a termination had been executed during active trauma intake. Bell told her to say the matter was contained. Dana laughed once, tired and brittle, and said nothing was contained. Nathan Cross was in the building. The CEO's chief of staff was awake, and legal had already used the phrase spoliation concern before sunrise. Bell lowered his voice and insisted they hold to process, emphasizing that Alina had already been problematic. Dana rubbed her forehead and said that if the footage showed what Priya claimed, Bell's addendum became retaliation. Bell answered that Priya was only a resident. Dana replied that she was also a witness. Bell dismissed her as idealistic. Dana said she was not blind. Bell leaned over the desk and warned Dana not to panic because of one military liaison who knew how to stand still dramatically. Dana looked at him with new distance and asked whether the previous concerns about Alina were concerns Bell had helped create. Bell straightened slowly and told her to be careful. There it was again, that small private threat he used when Alliance started to wobble. Dana finally saw it because pressure had stripped the social finish away. Upstairs, the unidentified patient from Coronado was identified as Lieutenant Commander Owen Mercer, executive officer attached to Naval Special Warfare Operations Support. Decorated, respected, not someone the newspapers would name lightly, but exactly the kind of person institutions took seriously behind sea. Closed doors. Bell learned the rank through a whisper at the desk and felt his pulse falter. Mercer mattered not only because of title, but because men like Nathan Cross did not move quickly for everyone. By 6:10, the day shift was hearing the story in fragments. A nurse had gotten fired during a trauma. No, a nurse had saved a trauma and then been fired. No, she was not just a nurse. No, a commander had come in. No, Bell was under review. No, it was the quiet one, Alina. The phrase quiet one sounded different now. The footage review began at 6:22 in a second-floor conference room. Compliance attended, as did legal, the on-call administrator, the nursing supervisor, and an external risk consultant already retained by the hospital for accreditation matters. Bell was invited but not allowed to interrupt playback. Dana was there because her signature appeared on the termination documents and equipment oversight. Alina was asked to attend and did so only after receiving written rescission in her email exactly as she had demanded. She entered the conference room in fresh scrubs from Central Supply, hair tied back, expression unreadable. Bell nearly lost what remained of his composure at the sight of her. The woman he had forced out before dawn had returned through the front of the process, documented and protected. Cross was already seated at the far end of the table. He did not rise when she entered. He only inclined his head once, acknowledging a professional in a place that had not yet earned either of them. The footage played without drama, which made it worse. Grainy overhead video, timestamps, Bay 3 intake, Dana appearing with the folder, Bell holding the head of the bed, Alina looking at the patient instead of the politics, Alina calling the pressure problem, Bell dismissing her, Priya verifying, Miguel moving, the monitor sliding, Alina intervening, the patient stabilizing, the room watched in tight silence. Then came the consult room footage, the termination, Bell's body language, Dana's framing. Alina requesting preservation of records. Bell's corridor line about skill not excusing insubordination. The external consultant asked for replay. Once. Then again. After the second viewing, she said the situation was indefensible. Bell tried to protest, but the consultant stopped him with a raised finger and told legal to note any further interruption if necessary. The audit logs were worse. Alina's incident report on the trauma cart predated the failure by 3 days. Her report on altered transfer documentation predated the confrontation with Bell. The addendum Bell inserted at 4:14 had been entered after her termination and after the patient was stabilized. It contradicted witness statements and sequence records. Dana's authorization for immediate termination had been approved at 1:38 a.m. before the bridge collision even arrived, which meant the decision had already been prepared and only waited for a convenient moment to be executed. Convenient for whom became the question nobody needed to say aloud. At that point, the room changed in a final way. Belle looked around the table and found no safe faces left. Dana sat rigid and colorless, staring at the screenshot of herself handing Alina the folder while alarms sounded in the background. Legal folded her hands and directed both Belle and Dana not to access, alter, or supplement any record associated with the matter pending formal investigation. Belle said it was absurd and argued that Alina had acted beyond scope. Alina spoke for the first time since sitting down. She asked whether Belle would like her to identify the exact second when beyond scope became below standard. Nobody moved. Belle looked at her. She answered the unasked accusation more simply. She said she had only wanted the cart stocked. Cross then slid a sealed plastic evidence sleeve across the table. Inside was the damp scrap of paper from Mercer's pocket with the word Sparrow written on it. Belle frowned and asked what it proved. Cross looked at him for a long moment and said it proved nothing Belle was clear to understand. Belle scoffed, which was another mistake. Cross then turned to Alina and asked whether she consented to limited disclosure of prior service as relevant to demonstrated expertise. Alina considered and agreed to limited disclosure only. Legal leaned forward. Cross explained, for the record, that Alina Vale had previously served in advanced operational trauma environments under federal authority, and that her background included high-acuity field stabilization beyond ordinary civilian exposure. Specific assignments remained restricted. The relevance, he said, was simple. When she recognized a life-threatening pattern faster than the attending, she had not been guessing. Silence followed, heavier than any accusation. Priya sat very still against the wall, tears pressing hot behind her eyes not because she was shocked, but because recognition hurts differently than surprise. Lena had been exactly who she appeared to be all along, calm, precise, and uninterested in status. They simply had not understood how expensive those traits had once been. Belle managed to say that if Alina had that background, she should have disclosed it. Alina turned toward him and replied that she had disclosed every credential relevant to her position. The rest, she said, was not for his entertainment. Cross's mouth twitched once, almost a smile. Belle looked around for sympathy and found none. By 7 o'clock, the hospital was shaking, though of course the walls stayed still. Truth rarely arrives like thunder in institutions. It moves through email subject lines, frozen smiles, denied badge access, and the peculiar silence that falls when a powerful person enters a room and no one rushes to greet him anymore. Belle was placed on immediate administrative leave pending peer review and conduct investigation. Dana Kessler was removed from supervisory authority before breakfast. The trauma equipment audit expanded from one cart to the entire department. Risk management interviewed the night staff individually, and because the footage existed, fear no longer had the same chokehold on honesty. Miguel gave a statement. Priya gave a longer one. The transport medic confirmed that Alina had identified the chest pressure issue before the attending acted, and that the patient had tried to say Sparrow before losing coherence. Even the ward clerk, who had survived for years by staying neutral, submitted a note documenting Cross's preservation request and Belle's resistance. At 8:15, the chief medical officer arrived in person. That alone told everyone how serious the matter had become. She called a staff huddle in the emergency department, not behind closed doors, but in the central station where night and day shifts overlapped and gossip could become witness. Belle was not present. Dana was not present. Alina stood off to one side in borrowed scrubs, not seeking the center and somehow becoming it anyway. Dr. Helen Rourke was not theatrical. That made what she said more important. She told the assembled staff that there had been a failure overnight, more than one in fact, a patient safety failure, a supervisory failure, and a conduct failure. A staff member who had acted to protect a patient, she said, had been treated in a way inconsistent with both hospital standards and basic professional decency. Nobody moved. Then Rourke said that nurse Alina Vale was fully reinstated effective immediately, and that her file would reflect no misconduct related to the events under review. She added that retaliation against witnesses or participants in the review process would not be tolerated. Then came the part that changed the room. Rourke looked directly at Alina and apologized on behalf of the hospital. Apologies do not fix institutions, but public truth matters. Alina nodded once and thanked her. No speech, no triumph. Rourke continued, announcing an immediate external review of trauma readiness and chain of command practices, and said that Alina would be invited to assist if she chose. A murmur moved through the room. One resident who had laughed at Alina in the break room stared at the floor. Another looked at Priya with embarrassment and fear. Miguel let out a breath that sounded like disbelief. Bell had spent months teaching the department that Alina's quiet meant smallness. Now the highest medical officer in the hospital was asking her to help rebuild the system. After the huddle broke, staff drifted uncertainly, not sure whether to approach her. People who had ignored her now wanted eye contact. People who had repeated Bell's jokes suddenly discovered urgent charting. Priya walked up first and apologized for not speaking sooner. Alina asked for which part. Priya said it should have counted earlier. Alina said yes, it should have, but it had not, so Priya needed to learn from that. The correction was clean and free of cruelty, which made it easier to accept. Miguel approached next with his hands in his scrub pockets and said he had known she had a story. Alina answered that everyone had a story. Miguel admitted his was mostly bad dating decisions and student loans. For the first time that morning, Alina smiled fully. It changed her whole face, and half the station noticed. There was still one thing the hospital did not understand. Staff now knew Alina had been wronged, and they knew Bell had tried to bury the truth. They even knew Alina had a background far beyond ordinary civilian nursing. But they did not yet understand who she was to the man upstairs, or why Nathan Cross had crossed the city before dawn to ask for her by name. That answer came at 9:12 in intensive care. Mercer had regained enough consciousness for brief, supervised conversation. He was still weak, still breathing with support, his shoulder immobilized, face bruised, voice roughened by injury and treatment, but his mind was back. Cross stood beside the bed. Rourke stood near the door. Alina entered only after being asked. Mercer's eyes found her immediately and sharpened with recognition. He told her in a voice scraped raw that there she was. Alina moved to the bedside with the same quiet control she had used in the trauma bay and told him he was hard to kill. Mercer managed a rough answer. Cross explained that Mercer remembered the bridge up until impact. Mercer looked toward Rourke when he asked whether this was the one who had saved him. Rourke said yes. Mercer looked back at Alina and said he had told them they should listen to Sparrow, adding that he had not expected to say it in a hospital corridor. Rourke's eyes flicked from Cross to Alina. No one in the room missed the significance. For documentation, Rourke carefully asked Mercer what he had known when he arrived. Mercer swallowed and said that he had not been fully conscious, but he had known a voice. He had known calm. He had known that she caught the chest problem before everything went dark. Then he added two words that made the whole room reassemble itself around Alina. He said it was the same voice as Kandahar. Rourke went very still. Cross stepped in and said that was enough, but it had already been enough. Earlier clues snapped into one line. The challenge coin, the precision under pressure, the ability to calm veterans, the two-finger signal. The word Sparrow written on wet paper in a military officer's pocket as if, when the world narrowed and breathing failed, that was who you called. Rourke looked at Alina with a different kind of respect now. It was not spectacle and not hero worship, only understanding. She said that Alina had served with them. Alina answered, in the same understated way she had answered everything else, that she had served near them. Cross gave her a sideways look that suggested he recognized understatement when he heard it. Mercer, still watching her, said she had once hauled him through a dust wall with one good shoulder and shouted at him for bleeding on her boots. Alina answered that they had been new boots. Mercer laughed once and winced for it. Cross lowered his head for a moment. When he looked up, his voice had changed. It was softer and more personal. He told Alina that she had disappeared. Alina answered that she had retired. Cross said that was not the same. Alina agreed that it was not. Then in the quiet ICU room where the monitors sounded like punctuation marks, Nathan Cross stepped a little closer to her, glanced once toward the door, and spoke the name that made every joke, insult, and act of contempt from the night before collapse under its own stupidity. He called her Sparrow. Rourke heard it. The ICU nurse heard it. Priya, who had followed only as far as the doorway and stopped there, heard it too. The name settled over the room like a final piece of evidence, not because it needed explanation, but because everyone understood that it belonged to a history Alina had never used for leverage and never displayed for status. She had come into St. Catherine S. as a nurse, done the work, filed the reports, stocked the carts, and watched a smaller hierarchy mistake silence for weakness. She had saved a patient while carrying a termination envelope, walked out with dignity while the institution tried to humiliate her, and returned only when the truth had enough witnesses to stand on its own. By then, the hospital no longer heard quiet when it looked at her. It heard discipline, memory, field training, restraint, and the kind of hard-earned competence that does not announce itself because it does not need to. From that moment forward, no one in the emergency department would say the quiet nurse the same way again. The words had been used for months as a dismissal. then for hours as a source of uneasy awe, and now they became something closer to a correction. Alina Vale had never been small. She had only been exact. Bell had mistaken visibility for authority, Dana had mistaken policy for cover, and the rest of the department had mistaken her refusal to perform for absence. By sunrise, those mistakes had been documented, witnessed, and exposed in the one language institutions fear most, records that match reality. Alina did not need revenge, only evidence. She did not need to raise her voice, only to be right long enough for the room to catch up. And in the end, that was what broke the hospital open. Not a speech, not an outburst, not a dramatic unmasking. Just a nurse carrying a cardboard box in one arm, seeing the real emergency before anyone else, refusing to walk away from a dying man, and forcing an entire institution to discover too late that the calmest person in the room had once been trusted in far worse ones.